The world tore open without ceremony. No flash of cosmic light. No operatic thunder announcing the arrival of something that did not belong. Just a sound like the earth itself splitting along a fault line older than language. A wet, grinding shriek that silenced the birds from the Tornafuin to the shores of Drengist. And then a man fell out of nothing into the gray morning air above Balerion and hit the ground hard enough to leave a crater. He lay still for a long moment. Around him the forest of Nandungartheb pressed close, dense and wrong in the way that only places touched by two competing darknesses can be wrong. Morgoth's shadow crept down from the north, from the Iron Mountains where Angband squatted like a wound in the world. Ungoliant's ancient, hungry absence haunted the ravines from the south. Between them, Wadihiana the forest had become something that even orcs avoided when they could manage it. Spiders the size of horses moved in the canopy above. Webs thick as rope caught the weak light and held it prisoner. The man in the crater did not move for nearly a minute. Then he inhaled, a sharp, ragged pull of air, and his eyes opened. Brown, bloodshot, carrying something behind them that had no name in Elvish or in the tongue of the Valar. Something old and cornered and very, very dangerous. He pressed one hand into the black soil and pushed himself upright. His name was Logan. He knew that much. He knew the smell of his own blood, which was filling his nostrils now, along with something else. Something that made every instinct he possessed fire at once. This place smelled ancient in a way that his world did not. Ancient and saturated, as though the ground itself had been soaking in power and intention for so long that it had become a different kind of substance entirely. The air tasted of iron and starlight and something underneath both of those things that had no analog in any world he had ever walked through. He took stock. His knuckles ached where the claws had deployed on impact. A reflex, bone, and adamantium punching out through flesh as they always did when his body read danger. They retracted now, slowly. The wounds in his knuckles, 3 on each hand, small and precise as they always were, closed behind the claws as they withdrew. Slowly, too slowly. Logan stared at his hands. The skin knitted shut over the course of several seconds rather than the fraction of a heartbeat he was accustomed to. He could feel it happening, the familiar crawl of cellular regeneration, but diminished, like trying to hear music through walls. The process was there, just muffled, just wrong. He filed that information away without panic. Panic was a luxury. He'd stopped affording it sometime in the last century. The forest moved around him. Not wind. There was no wind. Something with too many legs shifted its weight on a branch 30 feet overhead, and silk dropped in a slow curtain toward his shoulder. Logan caught the strand between 2 fingers before it touched him, looked up at the shape in the canopy, massive, patient, regarding him with a cluster of eyes that reflected what little gray light filtered through the webs, and felt the berserker stir in the deep part of him where it always lived. "Not today," he said. His voice sounded wrong here too. Too flat, too modern, like a gunshot in a cathedral. He moved. Navigation by instinct was the only kind Logan had ever truly trusted. An instinct told him to move northeast, away from the densest dark, toward what his nose identified as running water, and beneath that, wood smoke. Where there was fire, there were people. Where there were people, there were answers, or enemies. In his experience, those categories overlapped more than anyone liked to admit. He found the stream after 20 minutes of hard movement through undergrowth that seemed to resist him, branches catching at his jacket with a persistence that felt almost deliberate. He crouched at the water's edge and drank, and it was the clearest water he had ever tasted, almost aggressively pure, like drinking from something that had decided to be the platonic ideal of water and committed to the bit completely. He was still crouching when he heard them. They moved quietly. Whoever they were, they moved with a skill that would have impressed him if he'd been in the mood to be impressed. No snapping twigs, no displaced stones, just the faintest compression of wet leaves, a breath here, the ghost of metal shifting against leather there. At least 6 of them, surrounding him in a loose arc, taking their time, confident in their concealment. Logan stayed crouched. Let them think they had him. "You can come out," he said. "I can smell you." Silence. Then after a long moment, a voice responded in a language he didn't know, melodic and precise. And each syllable placed with the care of someone who understood that language was itself a kind of architecture. The tone was not friendly. The tone was the verbal equivalent of a drawn bow. He looked up. They were tall, pale in the gray light, and not pale the way exhausted people are pale. Pale the way marble is pale. Pale the way old starlight is pale. Their eyes caught the dim morning and held it in a way that human eyes do not. They wore armor that had seen real use, dented and scored and dark with old staining, and every one of them had an arrow knocked and half drawn and pointed at him with the calm precision of people who were very good at this and knew it. Logan straightened slowly. One of the elves spoke again, the same language, shorter this time, clearly a command. Logan spread his hands. Unarmed, look, he no threat, and managed what he privately acknowledged was probably not a reassuring expression. I don't suppose any of you speak English, he said. The arrow tips tracked his movement with absolute unsettling unison. Behind him, from deeper in the forest, something vast shifted in the dark between the trees, and the elf's eyes moved to it for just a fraction of a second. Professional, controlled, but there. Whatever was coming out of Nandungortheb behind him was big enough to make elvish warriors flinch. Logan didn't turn around. He'd face what was in front of him first. He always did. If you want to see more characters cross into different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The thing that came out of the forest was older than the trees it moved through. Logan heard it before he saw it. A sound like stone grinding against stone, rhythmic and vast, underscored by a wet clicking that his brain refused to categorize as anything natural. The elves had not broken formation, but their discipline was doing visible work now. The archer closest to Logan's left had shifted his weight back onto his rear foot. Another had tilted his arrow fractionally upward, recalculating for a larger target. Logan turned around. It was a spider. The word felt inadequate in the same way that calling the ocean damp felt inadequate. It was the size of a draft horse, and it moved with a horrible, fluid confidence of something that had never in its existence encountered a situation it could not simply consume. Its eyes, down all 8 of them, caught no light at all. They were the flat, absolute black of things that lived in places where light had given up trying. Silk trailed from its abdomen in thick ropes that caught on the undergrowth and pulled taut as it advanced, reorienting the geometry of the forest around itself with casual architectural malice. It had fixed those eyes on Logan. He supposed that made sense. He was the new thing. New things in a spider's world were either threats or food, and this one had clearly already made its determination. The berserker stirred again, harder this time. Logan let it come up just enough to sharpen him, that cold, furious focus that lived below conscious thought. And then he moved. Not away, forward. 3 steps closed the distance before the spider could recalibrate. Wei and his fist came up, and the claws deployed with their familiar triple snap, bone and adamantium catching the gray light for just a moment before they went into the creature's face. What followed was not elegant. It was not meant to be. The spider was fast, genuinely, horrifyingly fast for something its size. And it reared back, and one foreleg came down at an angle that caught Logan across the left shoulder and opened him from collarbone to mid-back before he could rotate away. He felt the wound as a line of white fire and registered, with the detached clarity that combat always brought him, that his body's response to the damage was slower than it should have been. The pain was staying. Normally, pain was a visitor. Here it was, settling in like it intended to rent the room. He kept moving anyway. The claws found purchase twice more, once at the joint where the creature's foreleg met its thorax, once directly downward through the top of its head where the carapace was thinnest. And then it was over, the massive body collapsing sideways into the undergrowth with a sound like a sail coming down, legs curling inward in that final, mechanical way. Logan straightened, breathed, pressed one hand briefly against his shoulder, and felt the wound still open, still bleeding freely, the healing factor working at its diminished pace. He turned back to the elves. They had not fired. He wasn't sure whether that was tactical discipline or something closer to shock. Their expressions and elvish faces, he was already learning, were not built for the full theater of human emotion. When everything kept interior and precise, had shifted into something he couldn't fully read. The nearest archer had lowered his bow by perhaps 10 degrees, unconscious. He probably didn't know he'd done it. One of them stepped forward. He was taller than the others, which was saying something, with hair the color of old copper pulled back from a face that had been through things. His right arm, Logan noticed, moved with a slight stiffness at the shoulder. An old injury, healed but not forgotten by the body. His eyes were gray, and they were doing what Logan recognized as the thing serious people's eyes do when they are rapidly revising their assessment of a situation. The elf spoke. The language was still incomprehensible, but the register had changed. Less command, something closer to question. Logan gestured at his own mouth, and then at the elf, then spread his hands. "I don't understand you." The elf studied him for a long moment, then in accented but perfectly functional English that hit Logan like a splash of cold water. "You are not of this world." It was not a question. "No," Logan said. "You are wounded." "Healing." The elf's gray eyes moved to the gash at Logan's shoulder, where blood had soaked through his shirt and was tracking down his arm in a slow, steady stream. The look on his face suggested he found the word healing to be doing considerable heavy lifting in that sentence. "Slowly," Logan allowed. Something passed through the elf's expression, a rapid calculation that Logan had seen on the faces of military men throughout his very long life. The weighing of threat versus utility versus unknown variable. And he had been the unknown variable in that equation many times before. "I am Gwyndor," the elf said finally, "of the house of Finarfin, in service to the High King Fingolfin, whose banner flies at Barad Eithel." He paused. "You killed a spawn of Ungoliant's brood. You did not run." "Not really my thing," Logan said. Gwyndor looked at him steadily. "What are you?" It was a better question than "where are you from?" Logan thought, more honest about what it was actually asking. "Something that shouldn't be here," Logan said, "but here anyway." He pressed his hand harder against his shoulder. The bleeding was slowing, but the pain was not. The soil of this place, he could feel it now in a way he hadn't in those first disoriented minutes. At a low-frequency wrongness coming up through the soles of his boots, felt saturated with something that his body recognized as inimical without being able to name it. Not poison, not radiation. Something older than both of those categories. Something that was already patiently beginning to work on him. Gwyndor spoke briefly to his companions in Elvish. Then he looked back at Logan. "Barad Eithel is 3 days east," he said. "The road is not safe. Nothing in Balerion is safe." A pause that carried the weight of a long history of that fact. "You will come with us. The High King will want to see you." Logan looked at the copper-haired elf, looked at the scouts behind him, arrows still loosely nocked, watching him with those light-catching eyes. Looked at the forest around them, which was full of things that had not been discouraged by what had just happened. "Sure," he said, "he'd made worse decisions. Barad Eithel was built for a siege that had already lasted longer than most civilizations managed to exist." Logan understood this the moment it came into view on the third day. A fortress carved into and out of the living rock of Eredwethrin, the mountains of shadow that formed the western border of Fingolfin's realm. It did not look like a place where people lived. It looked like a place where people endured, which was a different thing entirely, and the distinction was written into every surface. The battlements were scorched in places and repaired in others, and the repairs were scorched too. But the elves who moved along the walls had the particular quality of motion that Logan had seen in soldiers who had been at war, long enough that war had stopped being a thing they did and become a thing they were. Gwyndor had talked during the 3 days of travel, not constantly. He was not that kind of person, but in the patient, deliberate way of someone who understood that information shared carefully was a form of diplomacy. He had explained in broad strokes the shape of the world Logan had fallen into. The name of the enemy in the north, the siege that was not quite a siege, the long grinding stalemate called the Siege of Angband that had held for nearly 400 years and was, Gwinder said, with the flatness of someone reporting a fact they had made their peace with, beginning to fail. Logan had listened. One asked occasional questions, processed. He had fought in a lot of wars. He knew what losing looked like from the inside, and the Noldor of Barad Ithel had that look. Not broken, not despairing, but worn thin in a way that hope alone could not fully address. They were burning through something that could not be replaced at the rate they were spending it. Fingolfin received him in a hall that was grand and cold. The stone walls hung with banners whose colors had faded to ghosts of themselves. The High King of the Noldor was, Logan didn't have a better word for it, magnificent in the way that things honed to their absolute purpose become magnificent, with nothing left over for anything else. Tall, dark-haired, with eyes the precise color of the sky at the moment before full dark, and an expression that had clearly decided long ago that the performance of uncertainty was a luxury it could not afford. He looked at Logan for a long time without speaking. Logan looked back. Fingolfin said something in Elvish, and Gwyndor translated quietly at Logan's shoulder. He says you carry the smell of a world that should not exist, that the Valar did not make it. A pause. He asks what you are. I get that question a lot, Logan said. Gwyndor translated. Something shifted in Fingolfin's expression. Not quite amusement, but its geological ancestor. What followed was 3 hours of the most thorough interrogation Logan had experienced since a certain Canadian government facility he preferred not to think about. If Fingolfin was methodical and precise and had clearly decided that understanding this anomaly completely was more important than anything else on his schedule. He asked about Logan's world, his nature, his powers, the manner of his arrival. He asked about the claws. A demonstration was requested and provided, Fingolfin watching the adamantium emerge and retract with the focused attention of a man cataloging a new weapon. He asked about the healing factor, and Logan was honest about its current condition, because lying to someone this perceptive about something this important struck him as both futile and stupid. Fingolfin listened to Gwyndor's translations and sat with each answer before asking the next question. When it was done, he spoke at length, and Gwyndor's translation came in careful pieces. He says you are not Morgoth's work. He has seen Morgoth's work, and it does not look like you. He says the Valar did not send you. The Valar have not sent anything to Middle-earth in a very long time. Another pause. He says that leaves the possibility that you are simply what you appear to be. Something from outside the song entirely. Something Eru did not write. Logan considered that. Is that a problem? Gwyndor translated. Fingolfin's answer was brief. He says everything is a problem. The question is whether you are a useful one. Logan almost smiled. He was given quarters in the fortress, spare, stone, a bed that was slightly too long for him, and a window that looked north toward the distant smear of darkness that sat above Angband like a permanent bruise on the sky. He was given food, and which tasted extraordinary in the way everything in this world tasted extraordinary, as though the ingredients had made a sincere commitment to being what they were. He was not given freedom of movement beyond certain areas, which he noted without complaint. He'd been a prisoner in more comfortable places and less comfortable ones. And Fingolfin's caution was the caution of a competent commander, not a frightened one. What he was also given, though no one announced this directly, was observation. They watched him the way professionals watch something they haven't categorized yet. He caught it in the elves he passed in the corridors. That slight extra attention, the gaze that stayed a half-second longer than casual. Gwyndor was the most honest about it. Abe falling into step beside Logan on the second morning, with the directness that Logan was coming to recognize as characteristic. They are trying to determine if you will break, Gwyndor said. Break how? In this place? Gwyndor was quiet for a moment, looking north through a window in the corridor. There are men here who came to us whole and became less so. Not from battle, from proximity to Angband, from breathing the air of a world where Morgoth has been present since before the first sunrise. He paused. It does something, over time, to things that were not built for it. Logan thought about the soil, the low-frequency wrongness he'd felt through his boots since the moment he'd arrived, that had not faded but had settled into a kind of constancy, like tinnitus. He thought about his healing factor, sputtering along at less than half speed, and wondered what exactly it was working against. "And the elves?" Logan asked. Gwyndor looked at him steadily. "We were built in starlight before Morgoth's first rising. We are," he considered the word, "more resistant, not immune." His stiff shoulders shifted slightly. "Not immune." Logan filed that away too. That night, unable to sleep in the too long bed, he lay on his back and stared at the stone ceiling and felt the darkness of the north pressing against the walls of the fortress like water against a dam. Patient and cold and absolutely certain that patience was on its side. His shoulder had finally closed. It had taken 2.5 days. He pressed his fingers against the scar and felt the new skin, still tender, and thought about what Gwyndor had said. Not immune. And the sons of Fëanor arrived on a gray morning 12 days after Logan. They came with 100 riders and the particular energy of people who had long since stopped distinguishing between urgency and desperation, the two having merged in them into something that looked from a distance like purpose. Their banners were varied: 8-pointed star, a clasp of silver, a burning heart, and their horses were hard-ridden and their faces were harder. They had been summoned by Fingolfin for a council of war, Gwyndor explained, one of the periodic gatherings where the Noldor lords assessed the state of the siege and argued about what to do about it and generally reached conclusions that satisfied no one completely, which was apparently the best available outcome. Logan watched them ride in from the battlements. He'd developed a habit of the battlements. The view north was ugly and magnetic in equal measure. That permanent darkness above Angband, the way the light seemed to behave differently as it approached the northern horizon, flattening and dimming as though something up there was eating it. He found himself drawn to look at it the way a man with a bad tooth keeps finding his tongue, returning to the source of the pain. Compulsive, informative, not helpful. Medros he identified before anyone told him the name. There was something about the eldest son of Fëanor that the eye found and stayed on. Not beauty exactly, though he had that, but the quality of someone who had survived something unsurvivable and come out the other side as a different arrangement of the same materials. He was tall even by Noldor standards, red-haired in a way that looked almost aggressive against the gray morning, and his right hand was gone at the wrist, the arm ending in a scarred terminus that he carried with the complete absence of self-consciousness that comes only from years of integration. He had made the lost part of his geometry. Logan recognized that. He recognized it the way you recognize a language you learned under duress. Not fondly, but completely. Gwyndor introduced them that evening in a stone antechamber off the great hall where the council had recessed for the night. Medros looked at Logan with eyes the color of old amber and said nothing for long enough that it stopped being a pause and became a deliberate act. Then in accented English that was somehow slightly different from Gwyndor's, older feeling, and the syllables placed with different priorities, he said, "You are the one who killed the Ungoliant spawn in 3 passes." 2.5, Logan said. Something moved in Madros's expression, not quite amusement, the scar tissue of amusement maybe. "Gwyndor says your healing is compromised. Getting better." This was partially true. The rate had improved marginally over the 12 days. Wounds that had taken 2.5 days now closed in perhaps 30 hours. Whether this represented adaptation or simply the natural fluctuation of a suppressed ability, he couldn't determine. "Better is not the same as well," Medros said. "No," Logan agreed. "It's not." Medros looked at the hand Logan was resting on the stone table between them. The knuckles, specifically, where the faint scarring of the claw slots was always visible. And does it hurt when they come out?" "Every time." Medros was quiet for a moment. "I was held by my right hand," he said without preamble, without the performance of reluctance that lesser people used to make their suffering more palatable. "From the peaks of Thangorodrim, for 30 years. The hand did not survive the rescue." Logan looked at him, at the ended arm, at the amber eyes that were giving him this information, the way you give someone a tool. "Here, this might be useful to you. Take it." "Morgoth did that," Logan said. "Yes." "And you're still fighting him?" "Yes." A pause. "What else would I do?" It wasn't a question. Logan understood that. It was the thing people said when the answer was so obvious that putting it in question form would be an insult to both parties. They sat in the stone room for another hour, and Medros talked about the war with the clinical precision of someone who had been in it long enough to have lost the ability to find it remarkable. The siege was failing. He said this plainly, without the careful hedging that Logan had noticed in Fingolfin's council, where the same truth was apparently still requiring diplomatic packaging. Morgoth was probing the borders more frequently. The eastern passes were increasingly difficult to hold. The Fëanorian holdings in the east were taking pressure from directions that hadn't been a concern a century ago. "He's learning," Logan said. Madros looked at him sharply. "The probing, the different angles. He's not trying to break through yet. He's mapping." Logan had seen this before, in forests in Vietnam, in mountains in Korea, or in places he'd been sent to do things that history had subsequently decided not to record. "He's figuring out where you're thin." Madros was silent for a long moment. "The council does not discuss it in those terms. The council should." Another silence. Longer. Madros looked at the table between them, and Logan had the sense of watching someone integrate new information into a model they'd already built, and finding that it changed the shape of the model considerably. "You have fought many wars," Medros said. "Yeah. How many?" Logan thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which he rarely did because the honest answer was uncomfortable in ways that didn't get more comfortable with repetition. "Lost count," he said finally. "A lot of them were the same war with different names." Madros nodded slowly, it as though this confirmed something. But underneath the conversation, underneath the tactical clarity and the recognition and the strange kinship of two beings defined by damage they'd chosen to keep surviving, Logan was aware of something else. Something he'd been aware of since the sons of Fëanor had ridden through the gates that morning. A difference in the air around them, specific and identifiable once you knew to look for it. They were cursed. He didn't know the details yet, but he could smell it on them the way he could smell illness on people before they knew they were sick. Something in the quality of their presence, an additional weight that had nothing to do with grief or weariness, and everything to do with something bound into them at a level below the personal. An obligation that had metastasized, a promise that had become a disease. And underneath that smell, underneath the curse and the weariness and the amber-eyed competence of Medros across the table from him, Logan became aware of something else. The low-frequency wrongness he'd been feeling since his arrival. The thing in the soil, Morgoth's taint woven into the matter of Arda itself, was stronger here than it had been at any point since he'd landed. Stronger in the presence of people who had been in Middle-earth, fighting this war, breathing this air, for centuries upon centuries, as though proximity to those most saturated by this world's long darkness was accelerating something in him. He said nothing about it, but that night alone in the too-long bed, he found that his dreams were different than they'd been. Darker, louder, full of a rage that felt less like his own and more like something that had found him and was learning his shape from the inside. The men of the House of Beor came to Barad Ithel like an apology, not in manner. They were not apologetic people. The Beorians. They had the compact, weathered dignity of those who had learned that the world would not be making any special accommodations for them and had decided to be excellent anyway. But in number, there had been more of them. The delegation that arrived in the fortress's lower courtyard on a wet afternoon, 3 weeks into Logan's residence, numbered 40 where it should have numbered 140, and the gaps in their formation were the kind that don't come from poor planning, but from the specific subtraction of violence. Logan was in the lower courtyard when they arrived because the lower courtyard was where the Elvish weapons masters ran their training, and the weapons masters had, after a week of pointed mutual observation, extended something that was technically an invitation but felt more like a dare. He'd been working with them every morning since. It was useful in the way that all serious training is useful, not because he learned techniques he didn't know, but because working with fighters of this quality told him things about this world's physical laws that pure observation couldn't. How fast, how strong, how the particular quality of Elvish reflex differed from human reflex, and what that meant in close quarters. It also gave his healing factor something to practice on, which he suspected was either helping or slowly bankrupting him. He hadn't determined which. He was wrapping his hands when the Berian delegation came through the gates and stopped noticing what he was doing with his hands. There was a girl at the front of them who was clearly not supposed to be at the front of them and had gotten there anyway through a combination of forward momentum and the specific force of personality that certain people are born with and cannot be argued out of. She was perhaps 17 by human reckoning, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had recently finished the work of deciding what it was going to be and seemed satisfied with the result. She was looking at everything with an attention that was not the attention of someone sightseeing, but of someone building a map. Behind her, an older man, her father, in the resemblance was clear, was making the resigned expression of someone who had accepted that trying to manage this particular force of nature was not a productive use of his time. Gwynder appeared at Logan's shoulder with the reliability he'd developed over the past weeks. "The House of Bayor," he said quietly. "They winter here under Fingolfin's protection when the eastern borders become untenable, which they have become." A pause. "The girl is Andrith. She is considered," he seemed to search for the diplomatic formulation, "exceptional. Among their wise women, she asks questions that make Elvish scholars uncomfortable." "How old is she?" 17 years. Logan watched her stop in the middle of the courtyard and look up at the fortress walls with an expression of frank assessment, as though she was taking the measure of the stone and finding it adequate but not remarkable. Then her gaze came down and found him, across the courtyard, and stayed. He'd been stared at a lot in his life. This was different. This was the stare of someone who was already 3 questions deep into a line of inquiry that she hadn't yet decided to share. He looked away first, which he noted with mild irritation. They spoke for the first time 2 days later in the library, a room that managed to feel both vast and suffocating, lined floor to ceiling with Elvish manuscripts that Logan couldn't read and that apparently contained the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that had existed before the sun. Andrith was there when he came in. He cross-legged on the floor with a scroll across her knees and an expression of intense concentration that didn't shift when he entered. "You're the one from outside the world," she said without looking up. "Word travels. In Barad Ithel, everything travels. There are no secrets here, only information that hasn't found its audience yet." She turned a page. "Sit down. You make the room feel threatened when you stand in the doorway like that." Logan sat down. She looked up then and studied him with the same frank assessment she'd given the fortress walls. "Your wounds heal slowly, slower than usual, because of the marring." He didn't know the word in this context. She saw it in his face and set the scroll aside with the focused patience of someone who found explanation genuinely interesting, rather than merely obligatory. "Morgoth," she said. "In the beginning, before the first sunrise, he wove himself into the substance of Arda, into the stone and the soil and the deep water. He diminished himself to do it, poured his power outward until it was everywhere and in everything. The elves call it the marring." She paused. "It means that everything in this world is slightly broken, slightly bent toward darkness at its foundations. You cannot live here without it touching you." Another pause, quieter. "You cannot heal here, I think, without healing against it." Logan looked at her. "You figured that out at 17. I figured out the shape of it. The elves know the details and won't share all of them." Something moved in her expression. The specific frustration of someone who has been told that certain knowledge is not for them. But the effect is observable. Men who come here whole leave less so, not just from battle. "I've been told. Has it started?" The directness of the question caught him slightly off guard, which almost nothing managed anymore. "What would starting look like?" Andrith looked at him steadily. "Dreams that aren't yours. Anger that comes faster than it should. The sense that something is learning your interior." She paused. "The Elvish word for it translates roughly as being read, as though the darkness is reading you, finding your weaknesses, filing them for later use." Logan said nothing. She took his silence for the answer it was. "You should know," she said quietly. Not with cruelty, but with the precision of someone who considered honesty a form of respect, or that the men who come here and stay too long, Some of them stop being able to leave. Not because they're imprisoned, because they've been changed enough that wherever they might go, they take it with them. Logan looked at his hands, at the knuckle scars, at the skin that healed too slowly in this broken world. "I'm not easy to change, John," he said. Andreth looked at him with 17 years of accumulated wisdom and the particular sadness of someone who had already learned that this sentence in various forms was what people said right before the changing became undeniable. "No," she said gently, "I don't imagine you are." Outside the library window, the darkness above Angban pressed against the northern sky with its patient geological certainty, and somewhere in the deep foundations of the fortress, in the stone that had been here since before the sun, Morgoth's taint ran like a current through everything. Reading, reading, reading. The men of the house of Beor came to Barad Ithel like an apology. Not in manner. They were not apologetic people. The Beorians, they had the compact, weathered dignity of those who had learned that the world would not be making any special accommodations for them and had decided to be excellent anyway. But in number, there had been more of them. The delegation that arrived in the fortress's lower courtyard on a wet afternoon, 3 weeks into Logan's residence, numbered 40 where it should have numbered 140, and the gaps in their formation were the kind that don't come from poor planning, but from the specific subtraction of violence. Logan was in the lower courtyard when they arrived because the lower courtyard was where the Elvish weapons masters ran their training, and the weapons masters had, after a week of pointed mutual observation, extended something that was technically an invitation but felt more like a dare. He'd been working with them every morning since. It was useful in the way that all serious training is useful, not because he learned techniques he didn't know, but because working with fighters of this quality told him things about this world's physical laws that pure observation couldn't. How fast, how strong, how the particular quality of Elvish reflex differed from human reflex, and what that meant in close quarters. It also gave his healing factor something to practice on, which he suspected was either helping or slowly bankrupting him. Thus, he hadn't determined which. He was wrapping his hands when the Baorian delegation came through the gates and stopped noticing what he was doing with his hands. There was a girl at the front of them who was clearly not supposed to be at the front of them and had gotten there anyway through a combination of forward momentum and the specific force of personality that certain people are born with and cannot be argued out of. She was perhaps 17 by human reckoning, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had recently finished the work of deciding what it was going to be and seemed satisfied with the result. She was looking at everything with the attention not of someone sightseeing, but of someone building a map. Behind her, an older man, her father, the resemblance was clear, was making the resigned expression of someone who had accepted that managing this particular force of nature was not a productive use of his time. Gwynder appeared at Logan's shoulder with the reliability he'd developed over the past weeks. "The House of Beor," he said quietly. "They winter here under Fingolfin's protection when the eastern borders become untenable, which they have become." A pause. "The girl is Andreth. She is considered," he searched for the diplomatic formulation, "exceptional. Among their wise women. She asks questions that make Elvish scholars uncomfortable." "How old is she?" 17 years. Logan watched her stop in the middle of the courtyard and look up at the fortress walls with an expression of frank assessment, as though taking the measure of the stone and finding it adequate but not remarkable. Then her gaze came down and found him across the courtyard and stayed. He'd been stared at a lot in his life. This was different. This was the stare of someone already 3 questions deep into a line of inquiry she hadn't yet decided to share. He looked away first, which he noted with mild irritation. They spoke for the first time 2 days later, in the library, a room that managed to feel both vast and suffocating, lined floor to ceiling with Elvish manuscripts Logan couldn't read, containing the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that had existed before the sun. Andreth was there when he arrived, cross-legged on the floor with a scroll across her knees and an expression of intense concentration that didn't shift when he entered. "What, you're the one from outside the world," she said without looking up. "Word travels. In Barad Ithel, everything travels. There are no secrets here, only information that hasn't found its audience yet." She turned a page. "Sit down. You make the room feel threatened when you stand in the doorway like that." Logan sat. She looked up and studied him with the same frank assessment she'd given the fortress walls. Your wounds heal slowly. Slower than usual. Because of the marring. He didn't know the word in this context. She saw it in his face and set the scroll aside with the focused patience of someone who found explanation genuinely interesting rather than merely obligatory. Morgoth, she said, in the beginning, before the first sunrise, he wove himself into the substance of Arda, into the stone and the soil and the deep water. He diminished himself to do it, poured his power outward until it saturated everything. The elves call it the marring. She paused. It means everything in this world is slightly broken, slightly bent toward darkness at its foundations. You cannot live here without it touching you. Another pause, quieter. You cannot heal here without healing against it. Logan looked at her. You figured that out at 17. I figured out the shape of it. The elves know the details and won't share all of them. Something moved in her expression. The frustration of someone told that certain knowledge is not for them. But the effect is observable. Men who come here whole leave less so, not from battle alone. I've been told. Has it started with you? The directness of it caught him slightly off guard, which almost nothing managed anymore. What would starting look like? Andrith looked at him steadily. Dreams that aren't yours. Anger that arrives faster than it should. The sense that something is learning your interior. She paused. The elvish phrase translates roughly as being read, as though the darkness is cataloging you, finding the cracks, filing them for later. Logan said nothing. She took his silence for the answer it was. You should know, she said quietly, with precision rather than cruelty, that men who stay too long stop being able to leave. Not because they're imprisoned, because they've been changed enough that wherever they go, they carry it with them. Logan looked at his hands, the knuckle scars, the skin that healed too slowly in this broken world. He thought about the dreams of the past week, the ones that felt like his rage but amplified into something architectural, something that wanted to be a structure rather than a response, something that was patient in a way his anger had never been patient before. I'm not easy to change, he said. Andrith looked at him with 17 years of accumulated wisdom and the particular sorrow of someone who had already learned that this sentence, in its various forms, was what people said right before the changing became undeniable. No, she said gently, I don't imagine you are. She picked up her scroll again, and they sat together in the library's cold silence. And outside the window, the darkness above Angband pressed against the northern sky with its patient geological certainty. Logan stayed until the light failed, and he told himself it was because the library was warm. He knew, with the part of him that had never been able to lie to itself successfully, that it was because sitting across from 17 years of clear-eyed human courage was the closest thing to an anchor he'd found since falling into this world. And the dreams had been getting louder, and he was not yet ready to admit what that meant. He left when the elvish scribes came to close the room for the night, walking back through broad Ethel's stone corridors with the low-frequency wrongness humming in his bones like a second heartbeat, slightly out of sync with his own. That night the dreams were not merely louder. They had begun, for the first time, to feel like somewhere he wanted to be. He came in the form of a wolf. Logan smelled it before he heard it, and heard it before he saw it. A wrongness in the night air outside the fortress walls, something that his instincts filed not as animal, but as intention wearing an animal's shape. He was on the battlements when it happened, unable to sleep again, standing in the cold dark with the northern sky pressing its bruised light down over everything, and the smell hit him like a physical thing. Ancient, cold, layered with a complexity that natural creatures didn't carry. The smell of something that had chosen its form the way a man chooses a coat. The wolf that materialized from the darkness below the walls was enormous and perfectly black, and moved with the fluid wrongness of something that had studied movement without ever having needed to use it for survival. Hornet stopped at the edge of the torchlight's reach and looked up at the battlements. It looked specifically at Logan. And then it was not a wolf. The figure that stood where the wolf had been was tall and pale, and wore beauty the way certain weapons wear polish. Not for aesthetic reasons, but because a well-maintained surface reflects what you want to see, and conceals what you don't. His eyes were yellow in the torchlight. His expression was the expression of someone who had already had this conversation many times in many forms and was curious, with a detached and genuine curiosity, about which version of it Logan was going to provide. Gorthor, Logan said. He'd learned the name from Gwyndor, Morgoth's lieutenant, the one they called the Cruel, which in a world that contained Morgoth as its benchmark for cruelty, suggested a specific and earned distinction. "You know my name," the figure said. His voice carried no particular effort to project and reach Logan on the battlements with perfect clarity regardless. "That's further along than most newcomers manage. You've been doing your research." "I do that?" "Yes." Gorthor looked at him with those yellow eyes, head tilted slightly in a way that suggested genuine interest rather than performance of it. "You're the anomaly, the thing from outside the song. We've been aware of you since you arrived, of course. Something that doesn't belong in Arda has a particular quality, like a wrong note in music you know very well. Morgoth finds you fascinating." A pause. "I find you practical." "Practical," Logan repeated. You're dying," Gorthor said, simply, without cruelty, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with cruelty. "Not quickly, not obviously, but the marring is working on you, and your healing, which I understand is considerable, in your own world, is losing the attrition war." He paused. "You feel it, the dreams, the anger that isn't entirely yours anymore, the way the rage has begun to have a shape it didn't have before." Logan said nothing. He kept his hands on the stone of the battlements and kept his face still and kept his breathing even and gave nothing away that he could avoid giving. Gorthor seemed entirely unbothered by the silence. "Here is what I am able to offer," he said, with the tone of someone presenting a business arrangement they consider fair. "Morgoth's power saturates Arda. It is, at this point, it's simply part of the world's physics. What is diminishing your healing is not malice directed at you specifically. You're simply an incompatible element encountering an environment you weren't built for." A pause. "But that incompatibility can be resolved. Your healing factor can be restored, fully, completely, as it functioned in your own world and perhaps beyond, if the marring in you is replaced with something aligned rather than inimical. If you are, in a word, integrated." "Integrated," Logan said. "Made part of Morgoth's design rather than a foreign object in it. Your power restored, your pain ended. And in exchange," Gorthor tilted his head slightly further, "you serve, for a time, in a capacity suited to your abilities." The wind moved across the battlements, cold and carrying the iron smell of the north. Logan looked at the pale figure below and felt the thing in his chest that had been building for 6 weeks. The rage with architecture, the anger that had learned patience from somewhere it had no business learning patience. Stir in response to what was being offered, not with desire, with recognition, the way you recognize a voice you've been hearing in your sleep. "What exactly does serving look like?" he said. "Targeted, clean. You would not be asked to slaughter innocents." A pause. "Morgoth has enemies more dangerous than innocents. Fingolfin, Madaros, others whose removal would shorten this war considerably. You would be asked to remove obstacles, using your particular gifts. Assassinations. Corrections," Gorthor said pleasantly. Logan looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked north, at the darkness above Ungban, under at the bruised permanent twilight that sat over Morgoth's fortress like a crown. He thought about Fingolfin in his cold great hall, burning through something irreplaceable. He thought about Medros and the ended arm, and the amber eyes that had given him their damage like a tool. Here, this might be useful to you. He thought about Andreth on the library floor, cross-legged, telling him the truth about what was happening to him with the steady voice of someone who considered honesty a form of love. He thought about the dreams. He thought about how much easier it would be if the rage had somewhere real to go. "No," he said. Gorthor looked at him. "You understand the alternative." "Yeah." Logan pushed off the battlements and straightened. "I'll manage." A long pause. Gorthor's yellow eyes stayed on him with an expression that had shifted from interest to something that was not quite respect but was adjacent to it. the look of someone recalibrating an estimate upward while simultaneously noting that the estimate would need to be recalibrated again later, under different circumstances. You will change your mind, Gorthor said. Not as a threat, as an observation. Not because you are weak, because the Maring is patient and you are not made of stone. He paused. When the pain becomes sufficient, when the dreams have finished their work, when the anger has grown roots deep enough that you can no longer locate where it ends and you begin, the offer will still be available. Morgoth does not withdraw offers. It is one of his few consistent courtesies. The wolf shape returned between one blink and the next, black and enormous and already dissolving back into the darkness beyond the torchlight. He has never met anything quite like you. Gorthor's voice came from the dark, already distant, already nowhere. He is looking forward to what you become. The battlements were empty. Logan stood in the cold and felt his heartbeat, which was steady, and felt the thing beneath his heartbeat, which was not, and looked north at Angban's permanent dark crown and understood, with a clarity that was worse than uncertainty would have been, that Gorthor had not been lying about any of it. He went back inside. He did not sleep. And in the library the next morning, when Andreth looked up from her scroll and read his face with those sharp young eyes and said, quietly, "Something happened," he told her. All of it, because she was the only anchor he had, and the current was getting stronger, and he was not too proud to admit, to her at least, that he was beginning to feel it pull. The Dagor Bragolic began with fire, not the fire of armies or siege engines or the careful tactical application of flame that military minds devise in cold rooms over maps. This was something categorically different, a river of it, a geological event wearing destruction as its purpose, pouring from Angban's gates across the plain of Ardgalan with the unstoppable indifference of a natural disaster that had decided to have specific targets. The plain that had been green and wide and the pride of the northern defense became, in the space of hours, a blackened wasteland. The siege of Angbon, in which had held for nearly 4 centuries, ended not with a battle, but with a revelation. Morgoth had been waiting, and the wait was over, and what he had been waiting for was this. Logan felt it before the alarm was raised. The low-frequency wrongness that had been his constant companion since arrival spiked suddenly, searingly, like a signal turned to maximum volume. The marring in Arda's bones resonating with the catastrophic outpouring of Morgoth's direct power across the north. He was on his feet and moving before the first elvish horn sounded from the battlements, his body responding to information his conscious mind was still processing. Barad Ithel became organized chaos with impressive speed. The Noldor were soldiers first and everything else second. And the machinery of their response to catastrophe was well-oiled from centuries of knowing this day was approaching. Riders were dispatched, messengers received. Fingolfin moved through the fortress with a controlled urgency that Logan recognized as the particular composure of commanders who understand that their own panic is a tactical liability they cannot afford, so they simply decline to have it. Logan found Gwyndor in the armory. "How bad?" he said. Gwyndor's face told him before the words did. "Ardgalan is gone. The fire crossed it in hours. The northern holds—" He stopped, began again. Many of the Noldor lords in the north had no warning. Angban's gates opened and the fire simply came. A pause waited with specific grief. Angrod, Ignor, Fingolfin's sister sons, yet we have had word. The past tense did the work that direct statement apparently couldn't. Logan absorbed this. 2 Noldor lords, princes by the reckoning of this world, burned in the first hours of Morgoth's offensive. The siege shattered, not by siege, but by eruption. "The Beorians," Logan said, "being evacuated to the fortress interior. The eastern approaches are—" Gwyndor paused again. "Uncertain." Logan left the armory at a run. He found Andreth in the corridor outside the great hall, moving with calm purpose against the flow of panicked men, organizing rather than fleeing, directing the older and younger Beorians toward the fortress's interior sections, with a decisive clarity that made her look, in that moment, considerably older than her years. Her father was beside her, and he was doing what capable people do when they encounter someone more capable than themselves in a crisis. Following her lead without comment, she saw Logan and something in her expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but the recalibration of someone who had been maintaining composure alone and now had company in it. "The children are still in the East Wing," she said without preamble. The elvish guards were reassigned to the walls. "Show me," Logan said. What followed was 20 minutes of hard movement through Barad Eithel's stone corridors, which were filling with smoke from signal fires on the battlements, the noise of the fortress's defensive mobilization, creating a constant percussive backdrop. There were 11 children in the East Wing, ranging from an infant to a boy of perhaps 12, who had decided that being 12 made him old enough to be unhelpful by arguing about evacuation. Logan resolved this by picking him up under one arm and carrying him, which produced first outrage and then, after a moment of recalibration, a reluctant and rather dignified silence. Andrith moved through crisis the way water moves through rock, finding every gap, filling it, moving on. Logan watched her from the corner of his eye while he carried the indignant 12-year-old and felt something complicated happening in the part of him that was still, despite everything, capable of being affected by human courage. He got them to the interior, and then the fighting reached Barad Eithel's outer approaches. He heard it first as sound, the particular audio signature of large-scale violent engagement, which he had enough experience with to parse quickly. Orcs, by the quality of the noise they were making, a significant number of them, hitting the fortress's eastern approach while the main attention of the defenders was focused north. Not the main assault, a flank. Surgical in its barbaric way. Someone had planned this. Logan left Andrith with the children and went toward the sound. The eastern approach was a narrow passage between the fortress wall and the mountain rock, wide enough for perhaps 4 fighters abreast, and the elvish defenders there were outnumbered in a way that math made problematic. Logan came into the passage from behind the elvish line and assessed in roughly 2 seconds, then went through them and past them and into the orc formation with his claws out and the berserker fully off its leash for the first time since he'd arrived in Arda. He had been careful until now, measured, aware of his diminished healing and unwilling to spend reserves he couldn't quickly replenish. The cost-benefit calculation had been consistently conservative. He abandoned it. What happened in the Eastern Passage over the next several minutes was efficient in the way that things are efficient when efficiency and brutality occupy the same space. He did not think. Thinking was not what this required. The berserker moved him through the orc formation with the fluid mechanical certainty of a process rather than a person. The adamantium finding gaps in armor and bodies with a precision that owed nothing to conscious direction. He took wounds, freely, recklessly by his usual standards. Blades found him from directions he didn't prioritize defending because the math said spending time defending those angles cost more than absorbing the damage. The healing factor labored to keep pace and fell behind by degrees, each wound staying open longer than the last. The cumulative debt of damage mounting in a way he could track by the way his body was beginning to feel heavy. He did not stop. When it was over, the passage was clear and he was on his knees in it, which he noted with the detached clarity that sometimes visited him after extreme violence. The part of his mind that ran assessments continuing to function after the part that made decisions had temporarily spent itself. He was bleeding from 9 distinct wounds. 2 of them were serious. The stone beneath him was wet and dark. His healing factor was working, slowly, with the strained quality of an engine running hot. And the rage with architecture, the anger that had grown roots, was singing. Not with satisfaction at the violence, with something worse, with recognition, with the horrible sense of being finally fully used for what it had been deciding, patiently and without his permission, that he was for. An elvish warrior crouched beside him, said something. He didn't process it. He pressed his fist against the stone floor, and the claws deployed against his will. Not a threat, a reflex. No, the berserker's last statement before it receded, and then retracted, and he breathed and became gradually more himself. The rage subsided. What replaced it was not peace. It was the memory of how the rage had felt, and the knowledge that it had felt, for those several minutes in the passage, like coming home. That was the thing that stayed with him. Not the wounds which were closing, not the carnage which he had made before and would make again, but the homecoming feeling, the sense that the darkness had found something in him that fit. Gorthor had said the Mering was patient, kneeling in the blood-wet stone of the eastern passage with Barad Ethel shaking around him under Morgoth's first real assault in 4 centuries. Logan began seriously to believe it. He made the choice on a Tuesday. As he didn't know it was a Tuesday. This world had no Tuesdays, had no weeks in the sense he understood them, measured time in ages and years of the sun, rather than the arbitrary divisions of a calendar he'd grown up with on the other side of reality. But something in him insisted on the specificity, the way the mind sometimes reaches for familiar frameworks when everything else has become unrecognizable. It was a Tuesday. He made the choice. These two facts lived together in his memory afterward, with the grim permanence of things that cannot be unmade. It had been 6 days since the Dagor Bragolach, 6 days since the siege ended and the world changed shape. Barad Ethel had held. The Eastern Passage assault had been repelled. Largely, the Elvish commanders noted in their careful way, it due to the intervention of the metal-clawed anomaly from outside the Song, which had bought the defenders time to reinforce. Logan had received this acknowledgement with the discomfort he always felt when gratitude was expressed for things done in Berserker state, because gratitude implied he'd made choices, and he was no longer entirely certain how many of the choices in that passage had been his. The wounds had closed, all 9 of them, over 4 days, the healing factor grinding through the repair work with the labored determination of something doing its job under protest. He'd lost weight. He could feel it in the way his clothes fit, in the slightly hollow quality his face had acquired that he'd noticed in the reflection of Barad Ethel's bronze mirrors. The healing was costing more than it was recovering, or the equation was trending in one direction. Medros had come to see him on the 3rd day. He'd sat in the chair across from Logan's bed with his ended arm resting on his knee, and looked at Logan with those amber eyes that had seen Thangorodrim and come back from it and said, without the diplomatic packaging that the Elvish lords usually applied to difficult observations, "You are diminishing." "I know," Logan said. "The healing." "Yeah. Is there anything—" Medros stopped, started again with the precision of someone who had learned that false comfort was an insult to the recipient. "Is there anything that would slow it?" Logan thought about Gorthar on the battlements, the yellow eyes, the offer. The way it had described his restoration not as a gift, but as a correction of incompatibility, which was almost worse because it was almost true. "Maybe," he said. "Nothing I'm willing to do." Medros looked at him for a long moment. "Good," he said finally, and meant it, and left. The choice, when it came sideways. It began with a scout's report. A Baorian man, one of the 40 who'd arrived with Andreth's delegation, who'd gone out with an Elvish scouting party to assess the damage to the eastern approaches, and come back alone and gray-faced with information that he delivered to Fingolfin's council in a flat voice stripped of inflection by shock. An orc raiding party, moving south along the mountain passes, carrying prisoners, Baorian prisoners, from a settlement 2 days east that had not evacuated in time. Logan was not in the council chamber. He heard it from Gwyndor afterward, standing in the corridor outside. Ashton felt the information land with the specific weight of things that require immediate action and cannot be deliberated about without becoming irreversible. "How many prisoners?" he said. 30, perhaps more." Gwynder's face was careful. "The council is debating a rescue force. The passes are. The tactical assessment is not favorable. Morgoth's forces are consolidating along the eastern approaches. Sending a rescue force risks. How long before the debate produces something actionable?" Gwyndor looked at him steadily. "These things take time. There are considerations of—" "How long?" A pause. "A day, perhaps 2. Logan thought about 30 Baorian prisoners moving north through mountain passes toward Angband. He thought about what Angband did with prisoners, which Gwyndor had described once in the flat clinical tone that people use when the facts are too large for normal emotional register. He thought about Andreth, who was in the library right now, who did not yet know. He went to find her. She was not in the library. She was in the east courtyard, standing very still in the cold morning air, and someone had already told her, because her face had the quality of a surface from which all non-essential expression had been removed to make room for something too large for the usual arrangements of feature. She looked in that moment ancient in a way that had nothing to do with years. She looked at him when he came through the courtyard gate. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "Then you know I'm going. The council, the council has considerations." He stopped in front of her. I don't." She looked at him for a long moment, the sharp young eyes doing their work, reading him the way she read everything, completely without flinching from what the reading revealed. "You're not well enough," she said quietly. "The healing is what it is." "Logan." She said his name with a weight that surprised him, that stopped him, that made him look at her properly, rather than through the task-focused lens he'd already applied to the next several hours. "If you go into those passes alone, in your current condition, against Morgoth's forces, probably bad odds." "Yeah, that's not what I'm saying." Her voice was very steady. "I'm saying that you've been fighting the Mering since you arrived. You've been—" She stopped. "The dreams, the anger. You told me. And now you want to go into the deep places of the mountain, into Morgoth's direct influence, wounded, with the berserker already closer to the surface than you can fully manage." She paused. "You might go in as yourself and come back as something else." The cold morning air moved between them. Logan thought about the Eastern Passage, the homecoming feeling, the way the rage had recognized itself in Morgoth's darkness, as though they shared a language. "I know," he said, "and you're going anyway. They're your people." Something crossed her face that he didn't have a name for, too complex for a single word, compounded of grief and recognition, and something that might, in a longer and kinder story, have been allowed to develop into something else. "Come back," she said. "Whatever happens in those passes, come back." He went. The mountain passes were dark and cold and smelled of orc and old stone, and the particular quality of Morgoth's influence that was strongest in high enclosed places, where the Mering had seeped deepest into the rock and the air carried it like weather. Logan moved through them with his claws out and his healing factor laboring, and the berserker riding higher than he liked, a passenger that kept leaning toward the controls. He found the raiding party 4 hours in, 33 prisoners, 16 orc guards, a warg running ahead as scout, which he took first and silently, dropping from a ledge above the pass with the adamantium, doing its work before the animal registered he was there. What followed was not the Eastern Passage. In the Eastern Passage, he had let go entirely. Here, a wounded and alone, and with civilians in the immediate blast radius of any loss of control, he held on, barely, with both hands, fighting the berserker for command of his own body, while simultaneously fighting orcs in a narrow mountain pass in the dark. He won both fights. The cost was considerable. By the time the last orc guard was down, he was on his feet only through the specific stubbornness that had kept him vertical through 100 years of things that should have finished him, and the healing factor was operating at a level that he would have described, if forced to be accurate, as theoretical. The wounds were present and accumulating, and the repair work had slowed to something approaching symbolic. He got the prisoners moving, south, away from the pass. He kept himself between them and the dark, and did not let them see how badly he was hurt, because frightened people needed something to follow, and something to follow needed to appear functional. 2 hours south of the ambush site, with Barad Ethel's distant lights becoming visible through the pass's southern mouth, the oldest of the Barian men, gray-bearded, with the eyes of someone who'd seen enough to stop being surprised by things, fell into step beside him and looked at him sidelong. "You came alone," the man said. "Council was busy," Logan said. The man was quiet for a moment. "You're badly hurt." "Healing." The man glanced at him again, at the wounds that were not, visibly, healing at any pace that justified the word. "Slowly," he said. "Yeah," Logan said. "Slowly." They walked south in silence, and Logan kept his feet under him through will alone, and did not think about the berserker, which had wanted very badly to keep going north rather than south, which had felt the pull of Angband through the mountain rock like a compass finding north, which had required in those final moments of the ambush something very close to everything he had to redirect. He thought instead about Andreth saying, "Come back." It was enough. Barely, but enough. Fingolfin rode north on a horse the color of despair. Logan saw him go. He was in the healer's quarters when it happened. Had been there for 2 days, which was 2 days longer than he'd have voluntarily submitted to if his body had given him any choice in the matter. The wounds from the mountain pass had closed finally, all of them. Why, but the healing factor had spent something in the closing that it was not immediately replacing, and the elvish healers had communicated through a combination of Gwynder's translation and extremely expressive facial expressions that if he attempted to leave before they were satisfied with his condition, they would consider it a personal affront. He had stayed, partly from tactical pragmatism, and partly because Andreth had come on the first morning and sat in the chair beside his bed and read from an elvish manuscript in a low voice, not translating, just reading, and the sound of it had done something to the volume of the darkness in his head that he hadn't found any other way to accomplish. She wasn't there when the horn sounded. He heard it from the healer's quarters, a single long note, high and clear and carrying something in its tone that was different from the fortress's usual signal language. Not alarm, not assembly, something older than both. He was out of the bed before the note finished and at the window before the echo died, and he saw Fingolfin in the courtyard below. The High King of the Noldor was in full armor, silver and blue, and it caught the gray morning light and gave it back transformed, the way that things made with genuine craft and genuine intention transform whatever they touch. His horse was white and perfectly still beneath him, as though it understood the weight of the moment and had decided that absolute stillness was the appropriate contribution it could make. Fingolfin's face was not calm, beyond calm, on the other side of calm, showing the territory that opens up when a person has passed through every available emotion and come out somewhere that doesn't have a common name. Gwyndor appeared in the doorway of the healer's quarters. His face was doing something complicated. "Tell me," Logan said. "He rides to Angband," Gwyndor said, "alone." A pause. "He will challenge Morgoth in single combat." Logan stared at him. "That's—" "Yes," Gwyndor said. "He can't—" "He knows." Gwyndor's voice was very quiet. "He knows precisely. He has always known. He is not riding north because he believes he will win." He stopped. "He is riding north because he has decided that the manner of his death matters. Because a king who rides alone against the greatest evil in the world, who strikes Morgoth 7 times before he falls, who forces Morgoth himself to bear wounds and walk with a limp for the remainder of time, that king becomes something other than a casualty." He paused. "He becomes a symbol, and symbols endure past the things that create them." Logan turned back to the window. Fingolfin rode through the gates of Barad Ithel, with his head high and his horse's hooves striking the stone with a rhythm that seemed to Logan, standing at the window above, to be the most dignified sound he had ever heard anything make. The elves on the walls watched him go in silence. No one called him back. No one offered to ride with him, because they understood, the way soldiers understand the things that cannot be said aloud but must be honored regardless, that this was not a rescue situation. This was a statement. Logan watched until the white horse was a point of light on the northern plain, and then gone. He stood at the window for a long time afterward. The healers said nothing to him about leaving the bed. They seemed to understand that the bed had become temporarily irrelevant. He found Medros in the great hall, alone, standing at the northern window with his ended arm at his side, and his amber eyes focused on a distance that the window's stone frame couldn't contain. Logan stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while, which was the appropriate thing, and they both understood it was the appropriate thing, and so they did it. "He told you," Logan said eventually. "He told no one," Medros said. "He didn't need to. There are things a king's face says that require no translation." A pause. "Sonanin, I have known Fingolfin since before the sun existed, since the light of the trees, before Morgoth destroyed even that." He stopped. "He has been waiting to do this for a very long time." "The symbol thing," Logan said. Gwyndor explained it. "It is not only symbol." Medros looked at him sideways. "He is also simply—" The amber eyes did something complicated. "Tired, as we are all tired, and he has chosen the form his tiredness takes, which is more than most of us manage." Logan thought about that. He thought about a very long life, about wars that blurred into each other, about the specific exhaustion that was not the exhaustion of the body, but of the continuity of self, of being the same person, carrying the same damage, through enough time that the damage became indistinguishable from the person. He understood, which with a recognition that sat in his chest like something heavy and warm and unwanted, exactly what Madras was describing. He's choosing how it ends, Logan said. Yes. On his own terms. Yes. Logan was quiet for a moment. That's not nothing. No, Medros said. It is not nothing. It is, in fact, the only thing. When everything else has been taken, land, kin, light, hope in any practical sense, the manner of one's ending remains. Morgoth has never understood this. He cannot take it because he cannot comprehend why it matters. A pause. It is his only consistent failure. The news came 6 hours later. A rider, half dead from hard riding and the proximity to Angban's influence that the route north required, who delivered the account in fragments between managed breaths while the hall around him went very still. If Fingolfin had reached the gates of Angban and cried his challenge, and Morgoth had come forth because Morgoth, for all his power, was not able in that moment to refuse, without yielding something he valued more than tactical advantage. His pride was not separable from his power. The refusal would have cost him something real. The duel had lasted longer than it should have been possible for it to last. Fingolfin had struck Morgoth 7 times, had driven him to his knees once, had wounded the greatest power in Middle-earth in ways that would, the writer said with a kind of exhausted awe, never fully heal. Morgoth would walk with a limp from that hour forward, bearing in his body the evidence of what one elvish king had chosen to do with the manner of his ending. He had fallen, in the end, to Morgoth's foot, and Thorondor, king of eagles, he had come from the heights and driven Morgoth back and taken the fallen king's body from the field so that it would not be desecrated, raking his talons across Morgoth's face in passage, adding one more wound to the count. The hall received this in silence. Logan sat with it. He sat with the image of a white horse on a northern plain and a king who had decided that the manner of his death was the last sovereign act available to him and had performed it with everything he had, who had struck the enemy 7 times, who had, in falling, accomplished something that 4 centuries of siege had not, had marked Morgoth, had made him bleed, had put something permanent in his body that would outlast the battle and outlast the age, had become, in the falling, something that would not fall. Logan thought about Gorthar on the battlements, the offer, the yellow eyes and the pleasant voice, and the promise of restoration, of the pain ending, of the healing factor returned to full capacity. He thought about the dreams which had gone quiet in the 2 days in the healer's quarters, with Andreth reading beside him, but which he knew were not gone, merely waiting. He thought about what he was becoming, slowly, in this broken world that was reading him from the inside, and finding the places where darkness could take root. And he thought about Fingolfin, not the death, the choice, the understanding that some things mattered more than survival, that the manner of your resistance was itself a form of resistance, that you could lose every material thing and still, in the way you fell, defeat something in your enemy that they could not recover. He was not ready to die. He had never been built for that particular form of nobility, and he knew it clearly. But there was something in what Fingolfin had done that was not only about death, was about the decision to remain yourself when the pressure to become something else was total and sustained and patient and winning. To keep striking, even when striking cost everything, to put your mark on the darkness before it put its mark on you. The hall around him was beginning to process its grief in the ways of elvish people. Quietly, internally, the mourning happening in layers too deep for immediate surface expression. Madros had not moved from his place at the northern window. Logan stood up, walked to the window, stood beside the eldest son of Feanor in the gray light. "What happens now?" he said. Madros looked north. "The war continues," he said. "Ma, it is what wars do." A pause. "The question is what we continue it as." Logan looked north too, at the darkness above Angband, at the permanent bruised sky that marked the place where the greatest power in the world sat behind iron walls, wounded now, marked now, carrying in his body the evidence of what one king had chosen. The darkness looked back, and Logan, standing at the window of Barad Ithel, with 9 closed scars on his body and a healing factor running on fumes, and something in his chest that the Marring had been patiently reshaping for weeks, made a decision. Not today. Not while he could still make it. He would not wait until the choice was made for him. He went to Andreth first, not because she was the logical first stop. Tactically, practically, the logical first stop was Metros, he who had resources and influence, and the kind of clear-eyed strategic intelligence that made him useful in the planning of almost anything. But logic had been losing ground to something older for weeks now, and what was older said Andreth first, so that was where he went. She was in the library. She was always in the library when the world became too large for the spaces that weren't the library, which he had come to understand was not avoidance, but the opposite. The way certain people move toward understanding when others move away from it, as a form of engagement rather than retreat. She looked up when he came in and read his face in the way she always read his face, completely and without flinching from what the reading revealed, and said nothing for a moment. And then, "You've decided something." "Yeah. Tell me." He sat down across from her on the cold library floor, which he'd never done before, had always taken the chair, maintained the distance that the chair provided, the small architecture of separation that kept things in the categories he was comfortable with them being in. He sat on the floor and looked at her directly and said, "The Marring is winning." She didn't look away. "I know. I can feel it most of the time now, not as something external, as something that's—" He stopped, found the words. "As something that started to feel like mine. The rage, the way it has a shape now, a direction. I go to sleep and the dreams are already there waiting, and they know my name." He paused. "And the healing isn't keeping pace. Every wound costs more than I recover. I'm running a deficit that's only going in one direction." Andreth was very still. "How long?" she said quietly. "Before it wins? Don't know. Weeks, maybe. Could be faster." He looked at his hands. "Gorthor's offer is still open. I could take it. The healing restored. The Marring resolved. In exchange for—" He stopped. "In exchange for becoming something I'd rather die than be." "You won't take it," she said. Not a question. "No. So what have you decided?" He looked at her for a long moment. At 17 years of clear-eyed courage sitting cross-legged on a library floor, in a world that was grinding itself to pieces around her, reading everything without flinching, asking the hard questions because she considered honesty a form of respect, and had extended that respect to him from the first morning in this room. Fingolfin chose the manner of his resistance, he said. He couldn't win. He knew he couldn't win, but he chose what his resistance looked like, and in choosing it, he put something permanent in the enemy that the enemy couldn't take back. He paused. "I've been waiting, holding on, defending, watching the deficit grow and telling myself I'm managing it." He stopped. "I'm not managing it. I'm losing it slowly. And there's a difference between losing slowly and choosing." Andreth looked at him steadily. "What would choosing look like?" "Angband," he said. The words sat in the library's cold air between them. "Not to challenge Morgoth," he said quickly, because her face had done something that required immediate clarification. "Not that. I'm not built for that particular form of nobility, and I know it." He thought of Fingolfin on the white horse, and felt the weight of that image, which would never leave him. "But Sauron, Gorthor, the one who came to me on the battlements." He paused. "He's the mechanism. Morgoth is the power, but Sauron is the architecture. The one who builds the systems, who deploys the influence, who came to me personally because he could see what I was and what the Marring was doing to me and wanted to use both." He looked at his hands again. "He knows me. He's been reading me since I got here. He knows exactly which direction I'm bending." A pause. "Which means I know something about where he'll be and what he'll expect." Andreth was very quiet for a long moment. "You're going to use what the Marring has done to you," she said slowly, "here as a weapon against the one who was doing it. The Berserker is closer to the surface than it's ever been. The rage has architecture, direction, patience. That's not mine. That's months of Morgoth's darkness reshaping me. He met her eyes. But I still get to choose where it goes. For now, while I still can. He paused. That window's closing. She looked at him for a long time. And if you don't come back, then I don't come back. He said it simply, without performance, because she deserved the simplicity. But I come back as myself, or I don't come back. I'm not, I'm not willing to let the third option happen. Where I stay and the window closes and the marrying finishes its work, and I become something that's still walking around wearing my face. Andreth looked down at her hands in her lap. And when she looked up, her eyes were bright, but her voice was steady, because she was who she was. I want to say something to you, she said, and I want you to hear it as information and not as an argument against what you've decided. Okay. You came from outside the song, she said quietly. Eru didn't write you. Morgoth didn't make you. You fell into this world from somewhere the Valar never imagined. And you have been in it for 3 months, and in those 3 months you killed a spawn of Ungoliant's brood in 2.5 passes. You held the Eastern Passage during the Dagor Bergalak when the Elvish line was breaking. You went alone into the mountain passes and brought 33 of my people home. She paused. You did all of that with a healing factor running at half capacity and the Marring eating at you from the inside. Another pause, quieter. Whatever you are, Logan, whatever Eru did or didn't write, you are not nothing. You are not just a weapon, and the world will be less without you in it. He couldn't answer that immediately. The part of him that had been conducting itself on pure tactical pragmatism for weeks encountered what she'd said and had no prepared response for it, because he had not been expecting sincerity at full strength, delivered without any defensive irony. And it landed accordingly. I hear you, he said finally. She nodded. Once. Then, come back. I'll try, he said, which was more honest than yes and more than nothing. He left before dawn, alone, and I'm moving north through the darkness, with his claws sheathed and the berserker present, but held. A passenger, still, barely still, but still, and the healing factor doing what it could with what it had. Madras had given him what he needed without asking too many questions, which was the gift of someone who understood that certain decisions required the courtesy of not being examined too closely by the people who cared about the outcome. Equipment, routes, the specific quality of amber-eyed silence that said, I know what you're doing, and I will not be the one who talks you out of it. The passes north were cold and dark and smelled of everything that was wrong with this world. The Marring most concentrated here, where Morgoth's influence funneled through the mountain channels toward the plain that had been Ardgalan. Might Logan move through them with the focus of someone who had decided and was now simply executing the decision, which was a different quality of motion than any he'd had since arriving. The waiting was over. The defending was over. He was choosing the manner of his resistance. The darkness pressed close, reading him as it always did, finding the places where the rage lived and the places where the Marring had taken root. He let it read. Let it find what it was looking for. Let it feel the architecture of the anger that it had built in him over 3 months, patient and thorough. And then he pointed that architecture north, toward the place it had come from, and he ran. The claws came out. The berserker came up. And Logan, from outside the song, from a world Eru never imagined, carrying 3 months of Middle-earth's darkness in his bones like a second skeleton, went to find the one who had built it in him and return it at full velocity. Whatever happened in the iron shadow of Angban's gates, whatever the darkness made of him or he made of the darkness, he would face it as himself, for as long as himself lasted. That would have to be enough. That was, he had come to understand in the gray and grieving halls of Barad Ethel, what enough always looked like. Logan walked south through a broken world and did not look back. He carried Madros's note and Andreth's words about restoration and Fingolfin's lesson about the manner of resistance. And he carried the Marring in his cells like a splinter too deep to remove. And he carried the berserker, which was patient and permanent, and his, for better and worse, mine always his. He was not what he had been when he fell into Arda. The healing factor that had defined him for a century was diminished. The anger that had always lived in him had been augmented by something ancient and dark that would not fully separate from it again. He had killed in these mountains in ways that the berserker had recognized as homecoming, and that recognition had not left him. But he had said no on the battlements. He had gone into the mountain passes for 33 people he didn't know. He had watched a king ride north to strike 7 blows against the greatest evil in the world, and understood, in the watching, something about the difference between survival and meaning that his very long life had somehow not yet finished teaching him. The havens were ahead. Salt air and wood smoke, and people who had chosen to build something lasting at the edge of a dying world. He would go there. He would see what came next. Above Angband, the darkness waited. It had learned patience from something older than patience. So it turned out, had he.